He said, "We'll grab food real quick, you stay with the bags." I sat for 3 hours until security asked if I was lost. I wasn't, but they were in the will. I was already tired before we got to the check-in counter at Miami International. My cardigan was too thin for the air conditioning, but I wore it anyway. It was the only one I had that did not make Marla roll her eyes. I sat quietly by the luggage, one hand resting on the suitcase they had asked me to guard, as if I might try to steal it. The line moved slowly, and I could hear Marla sighing with every shuffle forward. "Her wrinkles ruin the vibe," she said to Ben, loud enough for the woman at the counter to hear. He did not respond. He never did. "Can she just wait somewhere else?" she added. I stayed seated. I have learned, after 73 years, that people do not want you to speak when they are trying to erase you. They want your silence to make the job easier. The agent looked at me and then back at Marla. I could tell she was uncomfortable. She typed something, avoided my eyes, and handed over the boarding passes. Marla took them and held up one between 2 fingers, waving it toward me like a motel keycard. "Group E," she said. "That means you board last, Grandma. Don't worry, you'll find it." We walked toward security, or rather, they walked. I followed. At the TSA checkpoint, I did what I had done a dozen times before. I took off my shoes. I placed my bag in the tray. I held my arms above my head when the machine beeped, like always, because of the metal in my knee. The young officer asked if I had any replacements. I nodded and smiled. He was kind enough. But Marla was not. "You embarrassed us again," she snapped as I stepped off the scanner. "I told you about the knee," I said. "Then why didn't you remind me?" she replied, exasperated, as if I were a child who had forgotten her lunchbox. Ben said nothing, just picked up the bags and moved on. After security, they led me to a quiet lounge, not theirs. Not the nice one with espresso and armchairs, but the public one, with plastic seats and vending machines that only took cards. "You'll be more comfortable here," Marla said, gesturing toward a hard-backed chair near the window. "We'll come get you before boarding. Try not to wander." "Room service is a sin, Grandma," she added. "Don't touch anything." They walked away, both of them laughing at something on Ben's phone. I sat where she told me. I looked out at the tarmac, at the planes moving slowly like old promises. The chair was stiff, my back ached, but I did not shift. I knew how to wait. 1 hour passed, then another. They did not come back. My stomach growled, but my wallet was in Marla's purse, where she had placed it that morning, for convenience. I watched the lounge slowly empty as other flights boarded. A man spilled his coffee and cursed. A woman nearby tried to hush her crying toddler with a bag of goldfish crackers. I sat still. By the 3rd hour, my hands had started to feel cold. A young security officer approached. He wore a bright vest and had kind eyes. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you lost?" I looked up at him and smiled. "No, son," I said, "but they are, in more ways than they know." He hesitated, maybe unsure what I meant, but I did not clarify. He nodded and walked away. I returned to staring at the gateboard. Flight 204 to Nassau. Still on time. That was the purpose of the trip, after all. A cruise to the Bahamas. Marla called it a family reset. Ben said it would be good for me, a change of scenery. But I had the feeling that what they wanted most was distance. From my presence, from my questions, from my reminders of what came before. In my head, I went back to the last time I flew first class. It was 1986. My husband surprised me with 2 tickets to New York. He told me to pack a coat. We drank orange juice with champagne. The flight attendant called me Mrs. Ellison. I wore heels that pinched and did not complain because back then being seen was still a kind of honor. Back then I sat by the window. Since then, I have sat beside the luggage. Always the luggage. Birthdays, weddings, baptisms. I arrived early, left late, and never got a seat at the front. They always said Grandma likes the quiet, as if silence were a gift I had chosen instead of a cage I had been handed. That morning, as I waited and waited, I realized something. They had not forgotten me. They had planned it this way, to keep me on the sidelines, out of the photos, off the ship if they could help it, because once I stepped back into the center of the story, I might tell it differently. But I was done waiting for permission. Today would be the last time they asked me to sit with the bags. Before I was the woman in the lounge, I was the girl in the kitchen. I came to the Ellison house in the spring of 1968. I was 21 and had just buried my mother. I needed work, and they needed someone who could keep things clean without asking questions. I swept their floors, ironed their tablecloths, and never once broke a plate. I knew the routines before anyone had to explain them. The man I would one day marry was their youngest son, Harold. He was quiet and wore glasses that slid down his nose. He spoke to me differently than the others. Not kindly necessarily, but carefully, as if words were tools and he had learned how to sharpen them. We married in 1972. His mother did not come to the ceremony. His father gave us a check 2 days later. No words, just money. We built a modest life. Harold worked at the family bank. I managed the ledgers from home. I never put my name on anything. That was how things were back then. The man's name meant stability. The woman's name meant complication. Then came 1981, the year the bank almost collapsed. It was a bad year for many. Interest rates climbed, loans defaulted, the Ellison family faced ruin. The patriarch James Ellison Sr. sat at our kitchen table and cried for the first and only time in front of me. "We're going to lose everything," he said. Harold looked at me. I looked back. I had saved quietly for years, dollars tucked into envelopes, bonuses folded into coat pockets. I handed over the cashier's check without ceremony, $50,000. "All I had. Use it," I said. They did. The bank stabilized within 6 months. 2 years later, it was turning a profit again. In 1983, James came to our house with a briefcase. Inside were legal documents, typed and notarized. One of them was a certificate of shareholding, 30% ownership, placed in my name, not Harold's. He handed it to me and said, "This legacy is hers, not because she's family, but because she saved ours." I never told anyone outside the room. I kept the papers in a lockbox, hidden beneath linens in a chest Harold never touched. When Harold passed in 1995, I stayed in the house. It had become home, not just for me, but for our son, Benjamin, and eventually for his wife, Marla. I helped raise their daughter. I cooked their meals. I never asked for anything. Marla never liked me. From the beginning, she looked at me like I was furniture with opinions. To her, I would always be the help who married into privilege. She did not care for the past. She cared for presentation. She called me sweet in front of others, but rolled her eyes behind their backs. She suggested more than once that I should consider a nursing facility. "For comfort," she said, "you'd have your own space, your own people." Ben, my son, said little. He worked long hours, or so he claimed. When he was home, he buried himself in sports or spreadsheets. He loved me, I think, but not enough to protect me from the slow erosion of dignity. I watched as Marla began redecorating, not the living room or the kitchen, but the files. She asked about ownership, about wills, about signatures. She offered to help tidy up the estate. I smiled and said thank you. Then I changed the locks on my file cabinet. 3 months ago, I overheard a phone call. Marla was speaking to someone about transferring assets. I stood in the hallway and heard my name mentioned as a pending variable. She said something about declaring diminished capacity, followed by laughter. That night, I unlocked the chest and reread everything. The deed to the house in my name. The share certificate in my name. A letter, written in blue ink and dated October 14, 1983, from James Ellison Sr. It said, "To whom it may concern, this document affirms that the enclosed assets were granted to my full name without coercion or obligation, in gratitude and recognition of her critical role in the recovery and preservation of Ellison Banking Trust during its time of financial peril." I slept with that letter under my pillow. They believed I had no memory left, that I was fogged with age, that I was, in Marla's words, just along for the ride. What they did not realize is that memory sharpens when you are ignored. You begin to catalog everything: glances, tone, paper trails, intentions. They were planning to sell the house, to consolidate the accounts, to erase my name from the story like I had never been there at all. But I was there when the floors were dusty and the ceilings leaked. I was there before the bank was anything but fear and ink stains. I was there when they cried and begged and handed me paper in place of thank yous. They could call me old, but I was not obsolete, and I was not done. I sat back down in the lounge and took out my phone. My hands shook, but not from nerves. My fingers were stiff from age, that was all. I opened my email and scrolled through the unread messages, each subject line like a whisper of something just beyond control. One caught my eye. It had arrived 7 days ago, and I had skimmed it, thinking it was another bank update. But now I read it again, slowly. Pending sale of 1248 Hawthorne Drive, confirmation needed. My breath caught. That was my address, my home, the house I scrubbed, polished, rebuilt through grief and slow survival. I clicked the link embedded in the message and opened the attached document. At the bottom was a signature, my name. It was not mine. The loops were too neat, the angle too upright. I had signed enough birthday cards, enough documents, enough mortgage checks in my life to know what my name looked like. That was not it. I zoomed in on the page. The signature sat above the words, Owner Authorization to Transfer. My stomach did not twist. My eyes did not fill. That would come later. Maybe. But in that moment, I felt only a stillness. The same stillness I had felt when Harold told me he was sick. The same stillness I felt when Marla smiled too wide after telling me I had been moved to the guest list at my own grandson's wedding. I stared at the forged name for one more breath. Then I dialed Thomas. He answered on the third ring. "This is Thomas. It's me," I said. There was a pause. Then, "I was hoping I'd hear from you again." "I found something," I said, "and I think you need to see it." 20 minutes later, I was in a yellow cab, headed toward the little brick building off Grove Street where Thomas kept his practice. The cab smelled of strong peppermint and old cologne. I held my purse close to my chest, fingers curled around the zipper as if someone might try to take it. Inside my purse was a folder I had kept intact for over 40 years. Legal documents, share certificates, handwritten letters, every scrap of paper they believed was buried or lost. I stepped into Thomas's office and waited while his receptionist brought him out. He still looked the same, gray hair neatly combed, glasses low on his nose, suit slightly rumpled at the shoulder like he had slept in it once or twice too often. He opened the door and held it for me without a word. In his office, I sat down and opened my purse. From the inside pocket, I withdrew a folded envelope. Not the documents, not yet. First, I gave him the smaller item. It was a letter from my doctor. Recent, signed, a cognitive assessment. "I know they'll say I'm confused," I told him. "But I've been documenting my clarity." He read it, nodded, slid it back across the desk. I laid out the rest. The deed, the original certificate of ownership for 30% of Ellison Banking Trust. The notarized letter from James Ellison Sr. Thomas handled each piece like it was sacred, pressing his fingers gently to the corners before turning the page. "They forged my signature," I said. "They're trying to sell the house." "Do you have proof it wasn't you?" he asked. "Only 73 years of handwriting samples," I replied. He smiled. "That should do." I leaned forward. "I do not want a lawsuit. I do not want a battle." He raised an eyebrow. "I want distance," I said, "and protection. Not for me, for what they are trying to take." He nodded slowly. "A trust?" "Yes," I said, "but not one that gets passed around like a family recipe. I want it locked. I want it permanent." He sat back and laced his fingers. "We can form a charitable trust, a legacy fund. You'll transfer ownership of the house and the bank shares to it. As founder, you can dictate all terms." "Make it iron," I said. Thomas opened a drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad. "What do you want it to do?" he asked. "Help women like me," I said. "Older women, the ones left behind when the money moves on." He wrote that down. "And call it shadow legacy," I added, "because that's what they think I am, a shadow." He looked up. "It's poetic." "No," I said. "It's accurate." We worked for 3 hours, every clause, every restriction, every possible loophole closed like a door behind me. I requested a clause that no property under the trust could ever be sold for private profit. I asked for quarterly reporting to a board of independent women, at least one of whom had to be over 65 and retired. Thomas whistled softly as he typed. "I have never seen someone prepare this much retaliation without raising their voice," he said. "I have had time," I replied. They gave it to me. He clicked the final box and printed the draft. I signed each page, my real signature, slow and firm. When I was done, I leaned back and looked at him. "I am going to let them take their cruise," I said. "Let them think they've won." "And when they get back," he asked. "They'll learn the difference between ownership and entitlement," I said. Thomas folded the documents and placed them in a thick envelope. "I'll file it first thing Monday," he said. I nodded. As I stood to leave, I looked at him once more. "They forgot who I used to be," I said. "But I never did." Thomas spread the documents across his oak desk, each one weighed down by a small brass paperweight. He had a habit of organizing chaos with ceremony. I watched as he lifted the forged authorization to sell my home, my name there, neatly scripted in a hand that was not mine. "It is a forgery," he said at last, tapping the bottom of the page. "This is not your signature, and this power of attorney was never legally recorded." "Marla submitted it," I said. "Through a third party, quietly. She thought you would never notice. She thought I had stopped being the woman who notices things." Thomas shook his head. "We can press charges today." I looked at him for a moment, then reached into my purse. "No," I said, "not yet." I slid a faded envelope across the table. The flap was sealed in wax, brittle with time. The initials on the front, H.E., were barely visible. Thomas leaned forward and took it in both hands. He knew immediately. "Harold's handwriting," he said, almost reverently. I nodded. "He gave it to me a few months before he died, told me not to open it unless I was certain I had no other way forward." Thomas broke the seal, carefully, and unfolded the contents. Inside were 6 pages, the legal foundation of a trust. Shadow Legacy Trust, it was titled, established in 1994. Founder, Harold Ellison, beneficiary. Thomas scanned the text silently, his lips forming the shape of every clause. I watched him pause at key phrases: non-revocable upon activation, asset transfer conditioned upon breach of moral fiduciary care, created for the continued protection of the founder's spouse from internal family manipulation. "I cannot believe he drafted this without ever mentioning it," Thomas whispered. "He knew what was coming," I said. "He did not want me to live in fear. He wanted me to live with options." "But it was never funded," Thomas said. "Never activated. Until now. The trust was dormant, never funded, just waiting for a reason. The assets had stayed in my name, but exposure to family manipulation made them vulnerable. That reason had finally arrived." I reached into my bag again and retrieved 3 items: the deed to the house, the certificate of 30% ownership in Ellison Banking Trust, and a small red leather bank book, my personal account, one no one else knew existed. "I want to place all of it into the trust," I said. "Now." Thomas set down the papers and leaned back in his chair. "You realize once we do this, it is permanent. You cannot reclaim these assets later for personal use." "I do not need to reclaim anything," I said. "I already lived with them long enough. It is time they lived without them." He gave a small, tight smile. "Do you want to keep Harold's original terms or make amendments?" I thought for a moment. "Keep the structure," I said, "but add 3 clauses." He opened his legal pad. 1. The trust may never be dissolved or modified without a unanimous vote from a board of 5 women, each over 65, each with no blood ties to me. 2. No asset held by the trust may be sold for personal gain, only public interest. 3. The trust must actively fund legal aid for elderly women facing inheritance abuse. He nodded as he wrote, "Shadow Legacy becomes a shield." "No," I said, "it becomes a mirror. Let them see what they tried to steal, reflecting right back at them." He began the filings immediately. The house was re-registered in the name of the trust, with restrictions prohibiting sale or rental without board approval. The bank shares were reassigned, severing all rights of next of kin claim. My savings account was transferred to the operating fund to cover administrative costs and outreach initiatives. By dusk, the transfer was complete. The trust was live, the assets no longer mine, but no longer vulnerable. Thomas slid the final signature page toward me. I took the pen, slowly, with no hesitation. My signature, precise and clear, covered the line where Marla's forgery had tried to live. He folded the documents into a secure envelope. "There is one more matter," he said. "The fraud." "I know. I can submit the report to the Financial Crimes Division, but if you wait until they're out of state—" "They leave port Friday morning. Then I'll submit Sunday evening." We both understood the tactic. While Ben and Marla floated on Caribbean waters, sipping champagne and celebrating their imagined victory, the ground beneath their lives would shift, and by the time they returned, the house would be out of reach, the inheritance untouchable, the consequences already in motion. "I never wanted this," I said quietly. "I know, but I am no longer the one waiting for things to fix themselves." Thomas nodded. "This trust is a fortress." "No," I said, folding my purse. "It is a final boundary between what they believe I am and what I actually built." He walked me to the door. "Do you feel safe now?" he asked. "I feel remembered," I said. "That is stronger." They left on a Friday morning, full of sparkle and arrogance. The car that picked them up arrived promptly at 8, just like Marla had scheduled. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a sundress meant to flutter. Ben dragged their matching luggage across the driveway like it was a red carpet. Neither of them said goodbye. I watched from the window. Marla turned her phone toward herself and took a selfie by the car, the house glowing in the background. Later that day, I saw the caption, "Finally living our best life, without shadows." It was not subtle. Thomas texted me an hour later, "Vessel departed, jurisdiction shifted." That was the trigger. We waited for them to exit Florida waters. Maritime law is a patient friend. Once they were offshore, any legal motion they filed would be delayed in routing, jurisdiction disputes, or simply timing. That was the moment we moved. Thomas submitted the activation documents for the Shadow Legacy Trust, formally recording the transfer of title for the house, reassigning the banking shares, and placing a legal freeze on all trust-linked accounts. He logged into the trust's federal ID registration and activated the nonprofit protections. Then, with equal precision, he submitted the fraud report. It was a sealed file sent directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the State Attorney's Office. It included the forged signature, the unauthorized power of attorney, the bank's internal transaction logs, and the comparative handwriting analysis. He emailed me the confirmation. "All submitted, it begins," and I made tea, because I had already done the hardest part, surviving the long haul of disbelief, watching love curdle into entitlement, enduring the 1,000 cuts of being called extra in the house I had built. Now I simply waited. 8 days passed. They posted daily updates from the cruise. Marla shared snapshots of ocean sunsets, fruity cocktails, and spa lounges with hashtags like deserved and new chapter. One video even showed Ben opening a bottle of champagne with a butter knife while Marla cackled in the background. Their joy didn't bother me. What bothered me was that they thought it came at no cost. What bothered me was not their joy, but their assumption that it came without cost, without consequence, without memory. On the 9th morning they returned. The driveway camera, still synced to my backup email, captured Marla in oversized sunglasses, stepping out of the car. Ben followed, looking sunburned and slightly bloated. Marla marched to the front door, still rolling her suitcase, and reached for the handle. The lock did not budge. She pulled harder. Nothing. She stepped back, confused, and that was when she saw it. A newly installed metal plaque beside the doorbell, professionally engraved and affixed to the brick. Property of Shadow Legacy Trust. No trespassing. At first, I imagined she thought it was some kind of joke, something temporary. But then she spotted the change in the mailbox keyhole, the Ring camera, the alarm notice from a new security provider. All of it bore the trust's name. That was when she started yelling. I do not know what exactly she screamed. The footage had no sound, but I saw her arms wave. I saw her kick the porch rail. I saw Ben step back, look at his phone, and realize he had no access to the bank account anymore. They called the police. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes, calm, firm, uninterested in Marla's indignation. She pointed at the house. She pointed at her wedding ring. She pointed at her name on old mail. Then one of the officers pulled out a printed document. He handed it to her. I had seen that page before. Thomas had filed it the same day he activated the trust. An official notice of ownership change, legal, notarized, irrevocable. Behind it was a second page, marked Ongoing Investigation, a fraud case tied to the forged authorization form. Marla stopped talking. Ben went pale. They were told they had no legal right to enter the property. They were not owners, they were not tenants, they were not even guests. The officers left. Marla stood frozen on the porch for nearly 2 full minutes. Then she picked up her phone, stepped back onto the driveway, and began filming herself. "This is outrageous," she shouted into the screen. "I am being erased by a woman who was supposed to love us. She tricked us. We took care of her for years, and now she's locked us out of our home." She posted it. But the internet did not take her side. Within hours, users found her earlier cruise post. The contrast was too perfect, the timing too damning. Her video went viral, but not for the reasons she hoped. The comment section filled with screenshots, side-by-sides, and quotes. "She's old, she had her time," vias, "she just activated hers." I watched the views climb. I sipped my tea again. There was no anger left in me, only memory. And it remembered everything. I never expected the story to leave our street. I thought it might ripple through the neighborhood. A few raised eyebrows at the grocery store, maybe a quiet "good for her" from the pharmacist. But I was wrong. It started with a headline: "Small-town widow activates secret trust, blocks greedy heirs." The photo beneath it was a grainy still from the police body cam. Marla on the porch, mid-shout, pointing at the plaque on the wall, her mouth open, her eyes wild. The article detailed the events: the forged documents, the hidden trust created by my late husband, the timing of the legal activation while they were out of state. It didn't name me, not at first, just called me the grandmother. But people found me anyway. The hashtag spread faster than I could have imagined. Shadow legacy. Grandma did that. Trust over blood. Every hour brought new messages, new stories, new women tagging me, or rather, tagging the idea of me, with words like hope, finally, and I'm next. Someone even made a graphic, my silhouette in a rocking chair with flames behind it like wings. I laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny, but because it was so far from how I felt, yet somehow exactly right. Then came the video. An old live stream from Marla's cruise was unearthed in it. She sat beside Ben on a chaise lounge, sipping something bright and cold. Her sunglasses too large, her tone too smug. "She's old," Marla said, lifting her drink. "She had her time. Now it's ours." They both laughed. That clip traveled faster than any news story. It became the defining contrast, her words against the reality that followed. People called it poetic, some called it divine. Me? I called it inevitable. A producer from the local station reached out. I almost said no, but something in me, perhaps the same part that once agreed to scrub the floors of a house I would later own, told me it was time. I wore navy, no makeup. Just a brooch Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. I sat in the studio chair with my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. The host asked gentle questions. I answered slowly. "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" she asked. "I stayed silent to keep the peace," I said. But silence is not the same as absence. The room went still after that. I told them the truth, not just about the trust, or the house, or the bank shares, but about what it means to disappear, while still being present, to raise a family and still be treated like furniture, to know the value of what you built and still be told you don't belong in the room where it's being divided. When the interview aired, the response was immediate. Women wrote to me, strangers from every state. They told me about sons who pressured them to sign things they didn't understand, about daughters-in-law who called them a burden while sleeping in homes they helped buy, about nights they stayed quiet to avoid being called bitter. I read every letter. Some made me weep, some made me furious, but all of them made me certain I was not alone. The press picked up the story nationally. The grandma clause, they called it, an informal term for the new wave of interest in trusts, elder law, and asset protection for senior women. I was invited to more shows. I declined most of them, not because I wasn't honored, but because I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I was just a woman who remembered, and now the world was finally listening. ___. It was a Wednesday afternoon when they showed up. I was in the garden, trimming back the lavender, when I saw their car pull into the drive. The same car that used to park with confidence now hesitated, paused longer at the curb than it ever had before. Ben stepped out first. His suit was wrinkled, like he had slept in it. His tie was gone, his shoes dusty. Marla followed, slower than usual, her hair pulled back tight, her heels lower than she used to wear. They rang the bell, even though they knew the code. That, more than anything, told me they understood something had changed. I opened the door and said nothing. We were hoping to talk, Ben said, eyes low. About what? I asked. Marla answered for him. About all this? About what you did? I stepped aside, not to invite them in, but to let them stand in the entry. The threshold had become more than wood and paint. It was a line now. Ben looked around at the space he once called home, and for the first time in years he looked small inside it. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly. I should have asked instead of assumed. I nodded once. Yes, you should have. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Marla cut in. If you'd told me about the trust, she said, maybe I'd have respected you. I met her eyes. She was not apologizing. She was negotiating. I waited 30 years for one word, I said. Sorry, you gave me silence. Now I return the favor. Her jaw clenched. You blindsided us. You cornered me, I replied. There's a difference. Marla stepped forward, her voice rising. You could have taught me. You could have brought me in, but you wanted to control everything. I wanted peace, I interrupted. And when I could not have peace, I built protection. Ben rubbed his face, exhausted. This whole thing, it's not how I wanted it to go. And yet, I said, you let it. Marla shook her head. I'm still your daughter by blood. I tilted my head just slightly. Blood made you my daughter? I said softly, but character decided the rest. She stared at me like she had never really seen me before. Not as a burden, not as a background figure, but as something she could not undo. She cried then, not loudly, not performatively, but with a sudden shattering quiet. Her hands trembled at her sides, and for the first time I saw it. Not the loss of money or property or public reputation. It was the loss of narrative. She was no longer the heir of a legacy. She was the cautionary tale. Ben said nothing. He simply reached out and placed a small envelope on the side table by the door. We won't come back, he said. I nodded. They left. I watched the car turn at the end of the street and disappear. I didn't open the envelope until the next morning. Inside was a photograph, an old one, of Harold holding baby Ben with me standing behind them, smiling. On the back, Ben had written 5 words. I remember who you are. It was not enough to undo what had happened, but it was something, and that too has value. 1 year later, I lived in a smaller house. Just 2 bedrooms, 1 floor, lots of sunlight. I picked every piece of furniture myself. Nothing heavy, nothing dark. I let the air move through the curtains freely. I stopped locking my bedroom door at night, stopped checking the security feed every time I stepped outside. Peace, it turns out, is something you can decorate with. The Shadow Legacy Trust grew in ways I never imagined. Thomas helped expand it to 3 other states. We held workshops called Inheritance Has No Expiration Date, where women sat in folding chairs and learned how to read legal documents, how to protect their names, how to say no without shaking. Some came with tears, some came with folders. All of them came because they had seen something in my story that felt like a mirror. One day, I received a letter in thick cream-colored stationery. It was from a young attorney named Kira. I saw you at the airport lounge that day, she wrote. You sat so still, they left you there, and you didn't cry, you didn't scream, you just waited. That image changed my life. It made me go to law school. I kept her letter on my desk, folded but never hidden. The old house, my house, no longer stood as a home. It had been reborn as something better. We turned it into a community library, though not just for books. We called it the waiting room. It was a place where older women came to learn about trusts, wills, contracts. They practiced signing their names with steady hands. They read stories like mine and whispered, "This happened to me too." Every Tuesday morning, the same group gathered at the long table near the back. Widows, grandmothers, divorcées. They drank tea. They passed printed copies of their deeds to each other, just to prove they still had them. One woman brought her eviction notice. 3 months later, she walked out with a notarized deed in her name and her voice a little louder. That mattered, more than I can say. Then, one spring afternoon, I received an invitation. The annual shareholder meeting at the regional bank I helped save 40 years ago. My name had reappeared on the advisory list. I had not walked into that building since Harold's funeral. I wore a white blouse, my hair silver and pinned, my shoes low and clean. I did not rush. I moved like someone who belonged. When I stepped through the doors, the room fell quiet, and then, one by one, they stood. I walked slowly to the front, where a seat had been left open. I did not sit. I placed both hands on the podium and looked out. I once gave my silence as a gift, I said. They mistook it for permission. Now I give my presence, and that is not to be misread. Behind me, on the screen, appeared a photo in black and white, dated 1983. It showed me, young and nervous, standing beside Harold's parents. We were signing a document, the day they gave me 30% of their legacy, not because I asked for it, but because I had earned it. The room applauded. They appointed me honorary advisor emeritus, with full rights to vote on charitable allocations. I accepted, not because I wanted power, but because presence matters. Later that day, as I walked through the back garden of the waiting room, a small voice called out, "Grandma?" I turned. It was Ben's daughter, my great-granddaughter. She was maybe 7, with a notebook in her arms and dirt on her knees. "Do mean people ever get nice?" she asked. I knelt down, brushed a curl from her cheek, and smiled. "No, honey, but nice people get louder." She grinned and ran off. And I stood in the sun, surrounded by flower beds and folding chairs and all the echoes of women who had once been told to stay quiet. Not anymore. Not ever again. Every silence, every slight, every signature they thought I was too frail to question, and when the time came, I did not shout. I signed. And I waited. Now the house is gone, but the legacy stands, not in their name, but in mine. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told to stay quiet, then you're not alone. There's more where this came from. Subscribe to Grandma, True Stories, where silence ends and truth begins.